In the summer of 1809, in what would one day be Montana, a man without clothing was walking briskly, keeping a close eye on the people behind him. A moment later, he could see out of the corner of his eye that they had begun to sprint after him. The man then started sprinting as well, as fast as he could, because he knew if he was caught, what would happen to him would be horrific. This is his horrifying story, and as always, viewer discretion is advised. The sun was just starting to show over the mountain peaks on a summer morning in 1809 in what would one day be called Montana. John Coulter and his partner, John Potts, were already in their canoe moving along the Jefferson River and checking the beaver traps they had set during the night. This early work was done on purpose because it was the safest in a place where white trappers were not exactly welcome. And the two men understood where they were. This was territory belonging to the Blackfoot Native American tribe, and anyone working this region accept the risks involved. Trappers who worked this far west learned quickly that visibility could invite trouble. Smoke from a fire could be seen for miles, and footprints along a riverbank could lead to being tracked down. Even the sound of chopping wood could give away that unwelcome guests were in the area, so Coulter and Potts adapted. During the daylight hours, they stayed hidden, pulling their canoe into cover and avoiding unnecessary movement. They ate cold food when they could and spoke quietly, if at all. After dark, they worked quickly to set their traps, and at first light, they'd return to collect them before disappearing again. The reason for such a cautious routine came down to one incident years earlier, when one of the Blackfeet was killed by Meriwether Lewis during his infamous expedition with William and Clark. You probably know this as the Lewis and Clark expedition. And Coulter and Potts understood it better than most, as they were actually part of that expedition and had already had violent dealings with the Blackfeet before. Those encounters taught them to keep a very low profile in the area. As they continued moving along the trapline, Coulter slowed and began scanning the trees and tall grass near the water. He had heard a rumble in the distance, and it was slowly getting louder the longer he listened. Something suddenly didn't feel right, and Coulter told Potts they should get back in hiding, but Potts dismissed the idea by questioning Coulter's bravery. He believed the noise was coming from a stampeding herd of buffalo and that there was nothing to worry about, but Coulter wasn't so sure. Despite Coulter's trepidation though, the two got back to work and continued upriver, but as they did, the sound continued to grow more and more prominent. Coulter then stopped again, and before he could react, he saw movement on the banks. Blackfoot warriors began stepping off of horses and out from the grass and trees along the river. Soon they numbered upwards of 800, and all of them had their eyes fixed on the two men in the river. Using hand signals, one of the warriors then beckoned for Coulter and Potts to come ashore, and Coulter was quick to follow the command. He moved the canoe toward the banks before stepping into the water and then onto dry land. As he did, one of the Blackfoot warriors approached Potts in the canoe and stole his rifle, but Coulter snatched it back from him and handed it back to Potts. Potts then retreated from the bank in the canoe and refused to come onto land, despite Coulter pleading with him to do so. When it became clear that Potts wasn't going to surrender, an arrow was released directly into Potts' leg. He then responded by lifting his weapon and aiming at one of the warriors. A bang then echoed throughout the valley, and the shot instantly ended the Blackfoot that Potts had in his sights. This was a huge mistake, and that's when all hell broke loose. Before the gun smoke had even cleared, a volley of arrows made its way toward the canoe, and a second later, Potts simply slumped over. Horrifyingly, that was just the start of it. Coulter then watched as his trapping partner was gathered from the canoe and brought onto shore. Immediately, the warriors pulled out a variety of instruments and began to literally tear apart the remnants. As parts were removed, they were thrown in Coulter's face before they fell to the ground, forming a pile at his feet. And at this point, Coulter was sure he would meet a similar fate. After Potts had been completely destroyed, the Blackfeet stripped Coulter of his clothing and summoned a council to determine what to do with him. At first, the plan was to set him up as a target for target practice, but a Blackfoot chief appeared at the riverbanks with other ideas. After sizing him up, the chief asked Coulter a question that made his blood run cold. The chief asked him if he was a fast runner. Rewinding a bit though, by the time Coulter stood naked on that riverbank in the summer of 1809, he had already lived several lives worth of experience in places most Americans would never see. He was born around 1774 in Stewart's Draft, Virginia, which is a rural area that combined farming with frontier life. His childhood was defined by hard work, isolation, and learning how to survive in the wilderness rather than formal classroom education. Sometime before 1803, he left his family's farm and headed west to Limestone on the Ohio River. This was a rough settlement that would later be renamed Maysville, Kentucky. At the time, limestone was a jumping-off point for those who planned to keep moving west. And when Meriwether Lewis passed through in late September of 1803 while preparing for the famed westward expedition he helped lead, Coulter approached him about joining. As it turned out, Meriwether was looking for men who could handle the rough terrain and long stretches of isolation, so Coulter fit the bill perfectly. He then officially enlisted in the U.S. Army's 1st Regiment on October 15th that year while the expedition was camped at the Falls of Ohio. Now, by then, Coulter was already in his late 20s and older than many of the men who would make up Lewis and Clark's group. Early on, though, it became clear that Coulter's age didn't necessarily come with maturity. He had trouble adjusting to military discipline, so much so that he quickly earned a reputation as one of the expedition's problem men. He drank too much on New Year's Eve, disobeyed orders by leaving camp to visit a whiskey shop, and eventually found himself confined to his quarters for 10 days. Later, he was even court-martialed for threatening an army sergeant during a dispute over authority when both Meriwether and William were away. It was the kind of behavior that could have ended his role in the expedition altogether, but even in those troubling early days, Coulter proved himself to be too useful. Meriwether and William quickly realized that Coulter brought something to the group that few others did, and that was his exceptional skill as a hunter. He could apparently move through unfamiliar terrain and reliably return with meat, and that was worth dealing with a few disciplinary issues. The expedition depended on fresh game to survive, and Coulter helped keep the party fed when conditions made hunting difficult. As the journey continued as well, Coulter shaped up and was trusted with more responsibility. He was often sent out alone, sometimes far ahead of the main group, to scout terrain and look for game. He helped identify routes through the Rocky Mountains and once retraced dangerous ground in the Bitterroot Mountains to recover lost horses and supplies. When he returned, he brought back food for the expedition and even for nearby native groups who had offered to help while the expedition was struggling. And speaking of the indigenous people the expedition encountered, Coulter was apparently particularly adept at cooperating with native tribes. He had a strong grasp of nonverbal communication, which allowed him to interact with groups that spoke entirely different languages. Like, for example, in one key encounter, he used gestures and calm behavior to defuse a tense situation involving stolen horses and persuaded members of the Tushipawe Flathead tribe to accompany him back to camp. He also even enlisted the help of a young Flathead guide who helped move the expedition through difficult terrain where food was scarce. And physically, Coulter also seemed almost built for this kind of life. He seemed to never get sick, and while others suffered from illness and exhaustion, Coulter just continued hunting and scouting. Meriwether and William eventually trusted him enough to allow him to leave camp during periods when most of the men were ordered to stay put. Then, by the time the expedition reached the Pacific Ocean, Coulter had become one of its most reliable members. When the expedition finally turned back east in 1806, most of the men were ready to go home, but not Coulter. At the Mandan villages, which were collections of buildings built by the Mandan natives in present-day North Dakota, he encountered two trappers heading upriver into the Missouri country and asked Meriwether for permission to join them. Meriwether by then had so much respect for Coulter that he granted him an honorable discharge nearly 2 months early. So after traveling thousands of miles west, Coulter stepped from one boat to another and headed straight back into the interior. This decision marked the beginning of his next life chapter as a mountain man. The trapping partnership didn't last long, and much of Coulter's movements over the next year remains unclear. His routes were rarely recorded, and much of his time was spent alone or with small groups moving through contested territory. By 1807, he was heading back toward civilization when he encountered Manuel Lisa, a fur trader organizing an expedition into the upper Missouri River country. When he met up with Manuel's group, Coulter even recognized familiar faces from the Lewis and Clark expedition, including John Potts. So once again, Coulter was drawn back in, turned around, and headed back into the wilderness. At the intersection of the Yellowstone and Bighorn Rivers, Coulter helped build Fort Raymond, one of the earliest American trading posts in the region. Once the fort was established, he took on the role of Manuel's emissary, traveling between native groups to spread the word of the trading post. At the time, the region was unstable, and the Blackfeet dominated much of the territory because they gained access to horses and firearms earlier than many neighboring tribes. This put the Crow, the Shoshone, and the Flathead peoples at a severe disadvantage, and they were eager to trade for weapons. Coulter understood this and explained it to Manuel, who suddenly saw an opportunity for the trading post at Fort Raymond. After it was completed, Coulter was given another assignment to basically advertise for Fort Raymond, and he left in October of 1807. Over the next several months, he moved 500 miles through a vast and largely unmapped region. He crossed the Continental Divide, passed along Jackson Lake, explored Jackson Hole beneath the Teton Range, and crossed Teton Pass into what was then known as Pierce Hole. Traveling slowly north and east, Coulter is believed to have even reached Yellowstone Lake in modern-day Wyoming. Along the way, he encountered many of the geothermal features that defied explanation, like steaming pools, bubbling mud, and sulfuric waterways. In fact, when he returned to Fort Raymond in the spring of 1808 and told what he saw, few people believed him. His descriptions sounded so exaggerated to the point of being considered absurd. The region he described was then jokingly referred to as Coulter's Hell, a name meant to ridicule him rather than honor him. At the time, there was just no reason for anyone to think that such a place existed, but Coulter didn't argue. He just went right back to work. In the summer of that year, he was escorting flat-hood buffalo hunters toward Fort Raymond when a large Blackfoot force appeared and attacked. Coulter's group was badly outnumbered, and he was wounded in the leg by either a bullet or an arrow in the fighting. The situation looked grim, but things took a turn when a larger Crow force joined the fight and drove the Blackfeet off. Coulter would quickly recover from his injury, but the experience showed him the dangers of Blackfoot territory, and violence like that was becoming more common, not less. The region was full of unresolved grudges thanks to the killing of a Blackfoot by the Lewis and Clark expedition and the new pressures brought on by the expanding fur trade. Firearms were also changing everything on the frontier. The Blackfeet understood that their enemies were now being supplied by white traders, and the Crow and Flathead knew that refusing those weapons meant falling further behind. Men like Coulter were caught in the middle, trying to make a living while moving through a place that was already in the midst of a significant conflict. Despite the risks, though, Coulter went back to trapping in the region. That fall, he teamed up again with Potts and returned to the Three Forks area in present-day Montana, knowing exactly what kind of ground they were working. The Jefferson River, one of the headwaters of the Missouri, cut through territory the Blackfeet used regularly. Avoiding them wasn't completely realistic, so the two men relied on caution instead. But it wasn't nearly enough to prevent what was to come the following year. As Coulter stood on the riverbank in the summer of 1809 with the body of John Potts lying at his feet, he briefly contemplated how to answer the chief's question. Coulter knew in that moment exactly what the Blackfeet had planned for him. It was a native custom that he had heard about. Among the tribe, a condemned enemy was sometimes given a chance to run for his life, but it wasn't a sign of mercy. It was a test intended to end one way. A man would be released by the tribe, given a head start, and then hunted down by the Blackfoot warriors. This game of sorts was never meant to be about survival, and Coulter knew that. He had seen enough of the region and its people to understand exactly what was being offered to him, but running would also give him a far better chance than being tied up for target practice. Coulter then communicated to the chief that he wasn't a very good runner at all, but this was a lie. He stood about 5'10" and was in peak physical condition thanks to his days as an explorer, but he didn't want the chief to realize this and decide not to let him run and instead suffer some other horrific fate. If they wanted to make Coulter run, then he was going to run. After Coulter's reply, the tribesmen gathered briefly to make their decision, and in the end, it was determined that their new captive would take part in their brutal custom. They led him away from the riverbank and out onto open ground nearby. Coulter was still without clothing, without a weapon, shoes, or anything to protect him from the terrain that lay ahead. Hundreds of Blackfeet then moved in behind him and formed a loose line, with many of them removing their blankets in preparation to give chase. The run began without much ceremony. Coulter was given a head start of several hundred yards, and at the chief's urging, he began walking away from the tribe. He did this deliberately because he knew that the moment he started running, the chase would get underway. As he walked ahead, he kept a close eye on what was going on behind him, and the moment he saw movement, he bolted. Coulter pushed himself right away and set a blistering pace across uneven ground. Rocks cut into his feet and prickly pear toward his skin, but he didn't slow down. Within minutes, he was breathing heavily and blood came from his nose due to how hard he was working his body. Still, he kept going as about 600 Blackfeet warriors surged toward him. For the first stretch, there were many of them close enough that Coulter could hear their footfalls behind him, but he kept his focus on putting distance between himself and the angry mob. The only thing that mattered, and the only thing keeping him alive, was staying ahead. After several miles of desperate running, the sounds behind him began to thin out, and one by one his pursuers fell back. Unbeknownst to the chief, Coulter had always been a strong runner, and his endurance was now his only advantage, so he continued to push himself into the wilderness. Eventually, he risked glancing over his shoulder and noticed that most of the warriors were now gone. Only one single man remained close enough to threaten him. Coulter ran harder as his legs burned, but he stayed upright. He knew that if he stumbled even once, it would be over. After what felt like an eternity, he looked back again, expecting the lone warrior had given up the pursuit, only to see him no more than 20 yards behind him, and he had a spear. Even with as fit as Coulter was, he knew he couldn't outrun the warrior much longer. He had a decision to make: keep going and possibly get caught, or stop and fight for his life. Without warning, Coulter went from a full sprint to a dead stop and turned around with his arms high in the air. The move caught his pursuer off guard, and the warrior tried to stop just as quickly to launch a spear in Coulter's direction. Exhausted from the chase, though, the warrior stumbled forward, and as he did, the spear struck the ground and snapped in two. This left the end with the sharpened spearhead on the forest floor right in front of Coulter. Reaching for it first, Coulter grabbed the broken spear point and dove at the warrior and struck him. When it was finished, in one swift motion, Coulter jumped to his feet, snatched the warrior's blanket to provide himself with some cover, and disappeared into the trees. He knew that there were others who wouldn't be too far behind, so he had to keep running. Coulter reached the Madison River after roughly 5 miles of this. There he spotted a beaver slide leading into the water. Following it, he slipped beneath a massive driftwood known as a beaver lodge. As quietly as he could, he remained in there with only his face above the surface of the water. It wasn't long before the Blackfoot warriors began to arrive at the river with their war howls and screams filling the air. They searched the riverbank for Coulter, moving back and forth as they scanned the water, having no idea that the man they were chasing was right there. At times, members of the tribe even stood on the lodge itself, getting so close to Coulter that he could see their feet through the gaps above him. But he didn't move a muscle and stayed where he was to wait them out. For hours, this went on until the sounds of the search eventually faded. When night fell and the area went totally quiet, Coulter slipped out of the beaver lodge and swam downstream. He moved until he was certain that he had put enough distance between himself and his pursuers before climbing out of the water. Then for the next 11 days after that, Coulter walked through dangerous terrain and even climbed a snow-capped mountain wearing next to nothing just to avoid the Blackfeet. He traveled mostly at night and rested when he could, and to keep his energy up, he fed on roots, digging up prairie turnip when he found it. Finally, he stumbled into a trading post on the Little Bighorn River, exhausted, injured, and close to collapse. In all, he apparently covered 200 miles or 322 kilometers during the run for his life. Coulter eventually recovered from the ordeal, but he would never be the same. He didn't return to the wilderness much after his run. He had survived something no one was ever expected to live through, and while this could have boosted his self-confidence, he knew he'd never survive another encounter with the Blackfeet. In fact, not long after Coulter made it back to the trading post, word reached him that one of his old companions had been killed by the tribe in a brutal fashion similar to Potts. The man who was killed had also been one of the most capable men to come out of the Lewis and Clark expedition and was someone Coulter greatly trusted and respected. Coulter took his horrific death as a warning to never return to the wilderness of the territory. A year later, in 1810, he did help construct another fort near Three Forks, but his heart was no longer in the work. When 2 more of his trapping partners were killed by the Blackfeet, Coulter finally made his decision. He could simply no longer risk living as a mountain man. Before the end of 1810, he headed east. After nearly 6 years spent almost entirely beyond the edge of American settlement, Coulter went to St. Louis and eventually married a woman named Sally. They bought a small farm near Miller's Landing, Missouri, a place now known as New Haven. It was a calmer, less exciting life compared to his previous one, but that suited Coulter just fine after all he had been through. Farming didn't require the constant vigilance that fur trapping in contested territory did. He did, however, reconnect with William in the time after his survival run and shared with him what he had seen during his years in the wild. Coulter told him about routes, rivers, mountain passes, and places no one back east believed existed. William then took those accounts and used them to draw a map of the region. It was far from perfect, but for the next 75 years, it was the best and most accurate map anyone had of the area. Long after Coulter left the wilderness, his observation continued to influence how Americans viewed and understood the West. Another 2 years later, when the War of 1812 broke out, Coulter enlisted again, this time serving with Nathan Boone's Rangers. Records from the period are thin, and details about Coulter's final days are difficult to pin down, but his enlistment didn't last long. Some accounts say that Coulter fell suddenly ill and died of jaundice on May 7, 1812. Others place his death later, on November 22, 1813. Either way, he was only in his late 30s when he passed away. As for Coulter's run, as it's commonly known, questions have followed it from the beginning. There is a long-standing Blackfoot oral tradition that tells a different version of events. In that telling, Coulter was simply stripped and released as a warning to others who might consider trapping on Blackfoot land. According to this version of the story, the chase never happened, leading some historians to believe that Coulter later came up with a more dramatic story during his long walk back to safety. It's entirely possible that the tale of Coulter's Run is just that, as frontier stories often grew in the retelling, and Coulter had plenty of time to think while covering 200 miles on foot. With that said though, even the most skeptical version of the story doesn't undo what Coulter accomplished. He did encounter the Blackfeet and escaped. He did travel 200 miles from the Jefferson River to Little Bighorn. He did cross multiple rivers and mountain ranges along the way, and he did it without food, weapons, or proper clothing in hostile territory while surviving on roots. To this day, Coulter is still known and revered as America's first true mountain man. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching, and a special thanks to everyone who supports the channel on Patreon or as a channel member. If you're interested, we offer early access videos that are released roughly a week before the regular YouTube uploads. Also, if you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it using the form found in the description. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.